Brian, and this happened to me in the fall of 2022. I was 39 years old and worked as a sales representative for a company that supplied agricultural equipment across several states in the northwestern United States. A large part of my job involved spending entire days driving between small towns to visit dealerships, attend meetings, and close contracts. That week I was in Idaho and had spent the entire day meeting with clients in towns around Boise. My plan was to finish my last meeting in the late afternoon and drive to a hotel in Burley, where I would spend the night before continuing my trip the following morning. The problem was that the final meeting lasted much longer than expected. By the time I finally got onto Interstate 84, it was already completely dark. Traffic was light, as it usually is on that stretch of highway during the late night hours. There were long distances without gas stations, without any visible towns, and with almost no streetlights. The only things I could see were the white lane markings reflecting in my headlights, and every now and then, the distant red taillights of a truck far ahead. I was exhausted after spending the entire day driving and working, but I wanted to reach my hotel before 2 in the morning so I could get a few hours of sleep. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the wind rocked my car whenever I drove through more open sections of the highway. The radio could barely pick up any stations, and my cell signal disappeared throughout much of the drive, so I continued almost entirely in silence. After nearly an hour without seeing anything except a few trucks traveling in the opposite direction, I noticed flashing hazard lights on the shoulder. As I got closer, I realized it was a large truck parked with its hood raised. A man wearing a reflective safety vest was standing beside the cab, waving both arms to signal drivers to slow down and pull over. Instinctively, I eased off the accelerator for a few seconds. I thought he might genuinely need help or be trying to warn drivers about an accident farther ahead, but something made me keep going. The highway was wide. There was no smoke coming from the engine, and the man was waving far too dramatically, almost desperately, looking directly at every passing vehicle. I drove past him without slowing down again and watched the scene in my rearview mirror until the flashing lights disappeared completely into the darkness behind me. I kept driving, trying not to think too much about it. For a moment, I wondered if I should have stopped to see whether the driver needed to call a tow truck, but I quickly convinced myself that, at that hour and on that stretch of interstate, another truck driver would probably help him. Besides, I was alone and I wasn't comfortable stopping on the shoulder in the middle of the night. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just a few minutes before 1 in the morning. The highway remained almost completely empty. For several miles, I didn't see another vehicle traveling in my direction. Then something caught my attention farther ahead. Once again, there were flashing hazard lights on the right shoulder. At first, I assumed it was another disabled truck, but the closer I got, the more uneasy I became. The truck was positioned exactly the same way. Its hood was raised in exactly the same position, and there was a man wearing a reflective safety vest making the same exaggerated arm motions, trying to get passing cars to stop. As I drove past, my headlights illuminated the cab more clearly. It was the same truck. It had the same dark blue paint, the same faded company logo on the door, and even the same small flashlight attached to the front grille on the driver's side. It was impossible. I had been driving in a straight line for several miles without slowing down. There had been no exits, no turnarounds, and no parallel roads that could possibly have allowed that truck to appear in front of me again. At that moment, I completely abandoned any thought of slowing down. I stayed in the left lane and continued accelerating. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man immediately lower his arms and run toward the cab. Less than 10 seconds later, the truck's headlights came on. The engine roared to life, and the truck pulled away from the shoulder with a speed completely inconsistent with someone supposedly suffering from mechanical problems. A chill ran down my spine when I realized how quickly it was gaining speed. I looked in the mirror again and saw its headlights growing larger and larger. The truck merged fully onto the highway and rapidly closed the distance between us. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but my car simply didn't have enough power to outrun an empty semi accelerating down an almost deserted interstate. In less than a minute, it was right on my rear bumper. Then came the first attempt. Instead of simply passing me, the driver brought the front bumper within inches of my car, flashed his high beams repeatedly, and gave my rear bumper a slight shove. The impact wasn't severe, but it was enough to make the steering wheel shake in my hands and cause the car to wobble within the lane. At that moment, I realized this had absolutely nothing to do with a broken-down truck. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and focused on keeping the car as steady as possible. There were almost no other vehicles on the road, and the shoulder was narrow in many places. The truck stayed glued to my rear bumper for several more seconds before hitting me again. This time the impact was harder. My car drifted slightly toward the right before I managed to correct it. My heart was pounding, and my hands had already begun sweating despite the cold air blowing from the dashboard vents. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen showed I had no signal whatsoever. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and kept searching for any sign indicating an exit or a gas station. There was nothing. Just miles of dark highway and the reflection of the truck's headlights filling almost my entire rearview mirror. A few seconds later, it changed positions. It pulled out from directly behind me and came up alongside my car, partially crossing into my lane. It was as though the driver was trying to force me off the road. I had to steer slightly to the left to avoid direct contact while the massive trailer remained dangerously close to the driver's side door. I kept driving without looking at the truck anymore, focusing all of my attention on the road ahead. I knew that if I panicked or made one sudden movement, I would probably lose control of the car on my own. After almost 2 minutes of that, I finally spotted a reflective sign indicating a truck inspection station a few miles ahead. I had no idea whether it would still be operating at that hour, but it was my only chance. I kept my foot firmly on the accelerator and headed straight toward the lights beginning to appear on the horizon. The moment they came into view, I noticed an immediate change in the truck driver's behavior. He stayed alongside me for a few more moments but stopped trying to push my car. As I entered the access lane leading to the inspection station, brightly lit by floodlights and surrounded by several parked vehicles, I glanced quickly into my mirror. The truck slammed on its brakes before reaching the entrance. Instead of following me, it merged back onto the main lanes of the interstate and accelerated away, disappearing into the darkness within seconds. I pulled into the inspection station parking area, practically shaking, and stopped my car in front of the main building, unable to get out for several moments. I took several deep breaths before finally going inside. I was still trying to process what had happened when I found 2 officers working at the inspection station. I explained that a truck had chased me for several miles and had tried to force my car off the highway. They immediately went outside to check the roadway, but there was no sign of the truck. One of the officers asked me to show him exactly where the damage had started. Only then did I notice 2 fresh streaks of blue paint and a small dent on my rear bumper, matching the moments when I had felt the impacts. They documented everything, wrote down my description of the truck, and asked whether I had managed to read the license plate. Unfortunately, I hadn't. Throughout the entire chase, the truck's high beams had been shining directly into my mirrors, making it impossible to see any details on the front of the cab. One of the officers mentioned that they occasionally received reports of drivers being approached by people pretending to need help on isolated stretches of highway. According to him, I had done exactly what they recommended. Never stop in dark, isolated places unless you can safely assess the situation, and immediately head toward a busy location or a law enforcement facility if another vehicle begins acting aggressively. I spent the rest of the night at the inspection station because I simply wasn't capable of getting back on the road alone. After sunrise, one of the officers suggested that I continue my trip only after getting some rest and choosing a route with heavier traffic. They never discovered who had been driving that truck. I never received any updates about the incident beyond confirmation that the report had been officially filed. Sometimes I still think about the first moment I saw that driver standing on the shoulder waving for cars to stop. At the time, I felt guilty for not helping him. Now I realize that choosing to keep driving probably saved me from stopping completely alone on an isolated stretch of highway, with no lights and no cell service. What stayed with me most from that night wasn't the chase itself. It was realizing that the truck had never actually been broken down. That raised hood was simply the excuse he needed to convince someone to stop. Ever since then, whenever I take long trips at night, I keep my gas tank full, avoid driving too late whenever possible, and if I see a vehicle stopped in an isolated location, I'd rather notify the authorities as soon as I regain cell service than pull my own car onto the shoulder. Story 2. My name is Natalie, and this happened in late 2023 when I was 34 years old. I worked as a nurse at a regional hospital near Jefferson City, Missouri, and frequently worked 12-hour shifts. Since I lived in a smaller town nearly 50 minutes from the hospital, I was used to driving home alone in the middle of the night after long shifts. That week had been especially busy in the emergency department. I had spent practically the entire day treating patients and barely had time to stop and eat. By the time I finally clocked out and got into my car, I was completely exhausted. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep for a few hours before my next shift. The route I drove almost every day included a state highway that crossed a long bridge over the Missouri River. During the day, it was an ordinary stretch of road, but after midnight, it was usually completely deserted. There were almost no streetlights on the bridge, only my own headlights illuminating the pavement and the concrete barriers. I had driven across it dozens of times and had never had any problems. That night was unusually cold and a light fog was beginning to form over the river. The radio was turned off because I simply didn't have the energy to listen to anything after spending the day at the hospital. The road was almost completely empty. For several miles, I didn't see another vehicle traveling in the same direction. As I began crossing the bridge, I automatically eased off the accelerator, just as I always did because of the strong gusts of wind that often pushed my car around on that stretch. I was almost halfway across when I noticed two white lights waving several yards ahead. At first, I assumed they belonged to highway maintenance workers. As I got closer, I realized there were two people standing beside the roadway, each holding a flashlight and making wide gestures for approaching cars to slow down. They seemed extremely agitated. One of them repeatedly pointed farther down the bridge, as though trying to warn drivers about an accident ahead. My first instinct was to lift my foot off the accelerator. I thought there might really be an overturned vehicle or someone injured blocking the road. It was exactly when I began slowing down that my headlights illuminated part of the concrete barrier several yards behind them. There was a third man crouching there, hidden in the shadows, watching my car approach. The moment my headlights reached the third man, he made a quick movement as if to stand up. To this day, I don't know whether he realized I had spotted him or simply thought I was close enough. My exhaustion disappeared instantly. Instead of continuing to slow down, I slammed my foot on the accelerator. One of the men with the flashlight stepped toward my lane, raising an arm as though trying to force me to stop. The other man also moved several steps closer. For a split second, I thought they were actually going to stand in the middle of the road. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and kept my car perfectly centered in my lane. I drove straight between them without swerving. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of them jump onto the shoulder at the last second to avoid being hit. In my rearview mirror, I could only see the flashlight spinning as all three men ran toward the side of the bridge. My heart was racing and my hands started trembling on the steering wheel. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying to convince myself the worst was already over. Then I saw two headlights come on behind the barrier near the far end of the bridge. A few seconds later, a car suddenly pulled out from a small maintenance access area and merged onto the highway directly behind me. I immediately checked my rearview mirror. The vehicle had no front license plate and its headlights were aimed too high for me to make out the model. As soon as it entered the highway, it began accelerating rapidly. The distance between us closed frighteningly fast. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but my car was already approaching a safe speed limit for that stretch of road. In less than a minute, the other vehicle was practically glued to my rear bumper. The driver flashed the headlights repeatedly but made no attempt to pass me, even though the other lane was completely open. I kept driving without taking my eyes off the road. The car remained behind me for several miles, always keeping an extremely short distance. Twice it got so close that I could no longer see its headlights in my rearview mirror, only their glare reflecting throughout the inside of my car. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911 using the hands-free system, but the signal kept dropping in and out because of the area. The call never even connected. That's when I spotted a sign in the distance indicating the next highway exit. I remembered there was a 24-hour gas station just beyond the exit. Without thinking twice, I turned on my signal and moved into the deceleration lane. The moment I took the exit, I noticed the other car did exactly the same thing. My stomach instantly dropped. Up until then, I had still been trying to convince myself it might just be an impatient driver wanting to pass me. But if that had been the case, they would have stayed on the main highway. Instead, the vehicle remained directly behind me on the exit ramp. I kept driving without speeding up or slowing down too much, not wanting to lose control on the curves. The gas station came into view a short distance ahead, brightly lit. Several cars were parked near the pumps and a semi-truck was refueling. The moment I pulled into the station, I began honking repeatedly while driving straight toward the convenience store entrance, where several people were standing outside talking. As soon as the gas station lights fully illuminated my car, the vehicle behind me abruptly slowed down. Instead of entering the station, it continued straight down the road and disappeared into the darkness. I sat inside my car for several seconds, unable to let go of the steering wheel. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to take several deep breaths before I could even open the door. I went inside the store and immediately asked the clerk to call the police. He could tell from my condition that something serious had happened, and he locked the automatic entrance doors until the officers arrived. While we waited, I told him everything that had happened, from the people on the bridge to the chase after I exited the highway. About 15 minutes later, 2 officers arrived at the station and listened to my account. They immediately drove to the bridge but found no one there. They also never located the car on any of the nearby roads. One of the officers mentioned that the stretch of highway was extremely isolated during the night, and that they had received other reports involving people attempting to make drivers stop by pretending there had been an accident or that someone needed help. According to him, the safest course of action was exactly what I had done. Never stop in a dark, isolated location if there was any doubt about the situation, and continue driving until reaching a populated place before asking for help. Before I left, one of the officers walked with me back to my car to check whether it had been damaged during the pursuit. Fortunately, there were no signs of a collision or any indication that the other vehicle had actually made contact with mine. Even so, they documented the entire incident and recorded my description of the 3 people on the bridge and the vehicle without front plates. They repeatedly asked whether I remembered the make or color of the car, but the high beams had prevented me from seeing almost any details. I also couldn't identify the faces of any of the men on the bridge. The flashlights pointed toward my vehicle and the poor lighting around them allowed me to see only silhouettes. After finishing the report, the officer suggested that I remain at the gas station until I felt calm enough to drive again. I took the opportunity to call my sister and tell her what had happened. She insisted that I go straight to her house instead of returning to my apartment, and that's exactly what I did after daybreak. I slept only a few hours that morning, but I spent the rest of the day replaying every second of that bridge crossing in my mind. Today, I still work as a nurse and still work overnight shifts, but I've completely changed the way I drive after midnight. I no longer slow down for strangers waving me over on isolated stretches of highway, especially when there are no police vehicles, rescue trucks, or any other sign of a genuine accident. If I truly believe someone may need help, I keep driving until I find cell service or a safe place to notify the police. What stayed with me most from that night was realizing how carefully everything appeared to have been planned. 2 people drew driver's attention while a third remained hidden in exactly the spot where no one would think to look at first. If I had continued slowing down for just a few more seconds, I probably would have come to a stop in the middle of that bridge, with no way to turn around and no one else nearby. Even today, whenever I cross an empty bridge in the middle of the night and see a light waving in the distance, I think back to that night and keep driving until I reach a place where it's truly safe to stop. Story 3. My name is James, and this happened to me during the summer of 2023, when I was 21 years old. I was studying engineering at the University of Kansas and lived in Lawrence during the school year. But whenever I had a few days off, I liked to visit my grandparents, who lived near a small town in western Kansas. Since they were getting older, I tried to spend a few weekends with them whenever I could. On that trip, I decided to leave in the late afternoon because I still had to finish a college assignment before hitting the road. I figured I would arrive at their house shortly after midnight. The route included long stretches of nearly deserted state highways, surrounded only by farmland and open pasture. I knew that drive very well and had never had any problems traveling it, even at night. Before leaving, I filled up my gas tank, bought a coffee at a gas station, and texted my grandparents to let them know I was on my way. They replied, telling me to drive safely and call when I got close. At that point, the trip seemed no different from any of the others I had taken before. It was almost midnight when I entered a particularly isolated stretch of highway. There were no streetlights, and the only movement came from my own headlights illuminating the pavement a few yards ahead. For several miles, I didn't see another car traveling in the same direction. The radio signal was weak, so I turned it off and continued listening, only to the steady sound of my tires on the road. That's when I noticed a series of flashing red lights in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was an old school bus, parked partially in the roadway. It was one of those traditional yellow models, badly worn with age. Its hazard lights were flashing and the front door was standing completely open. My first thought was that it had broken down and the driver had gone to get help. I slowed down slightly to assess the situation. As my headlights illuminated the bus more clearly, I noticed something else that was strange. There was no one in the driver's seat. I also didn't see anyone walking around the vehicle or carrying flashlights. The highway was completely silent, and the bus looked as though it had simply been abandoned in the middle of the road. I continued slowing down because the bus was blocking part of my lane. At first, I considered stopping several yards behind it and calling the police, but the way the bus was positioned still left enough room to slowly pass on the left. As I approached, I tried looking through the windshield to spot the driver or any passengers. I couldn't see anyone. The inside of the bus was dark and empty. The front door remained open, swaying gently in the wind. I remember thinking how strange it was to see a school bus on that stretch of highway during summer vacation, especially so close to midnight. Even so, I kept moving forward slowly to pass it. Just as the front of my car was almost even with the open door, something moved on the far side of the bus. First, one person appeared, then another. In less than 2 seconds, several more figures emerged, silently walking from behind the vehicle. None of them were running or making frantic gestures. They simply crossed the road while looking toward my car. They seemed coordinated. My stomach dropped the moment I realized they weren't crossing to get away from the bus. They were walking directly into the only open path between the front of the bus and the shoulder, blocking my way through. I hit the brakes instinctively, but I immediately realized that if I came to a complete stop, I would be surrounded. I quickly pressed the accelerator again. The people kept walking forward without running. Some of them simply raised one arm, as though expecting me to slow down even more. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and aimed for the narrow gap that still remained between the front of the bus and the first man crossing the road. I barely made it through. One of them had to take a quick step backward to avoid being hit by my car. The moment I cleared the bus, I accelerated as hard as I could without losing control. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely breathe. I immediately looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see them chasing after me. Instead, something happened that frightened me even more. Every one of them simply stopped walking. One by one, they calmly walked back behind the bus, disappearing on the exact same side they had come from. None of them seemed rushed or angry that I had escaped. They simply returned to their previous positions as though they were patiently waiting for the next car to come down that road. I kept accelerating without looking back again for several miles. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the car steady in its lane. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but, as was common throughout much of that area, I had no signal. I kept driving, searching for any gas station, town, or even another vehicle on the road. Nearly 15 minutes passed before I finally spotted a gas station open near an intersection. I pulled straight into the parking lot, stopped beside the convenience store, and only then managed to catch my breath. As soon as my phone regained service, I immediately called the highway patrol and told them everything that had just happened. The dispatcher instructed me to stay where I was while an officer was sent to check the highway. He also asked several times how many people I thought I had seen. I told him I wasn't sure. I thought there had been at least 6 or 7, but everything had happened so quickly. What I remembered clearly was that none of them had said a single word. Every one of them had walked in complete silence. About 20 minutes later, a state trooper arrived at the gas station, listened to my full account, and then drove back with me to the highway. We returned to the exact stretch where I had encountered the bus, but there was absolutely nothing there. No bus, no people, and no sign that a large vehicle had been stopped there only a short time earlier. The shoulder was empty, and the roadway was completely clear. The officer drove several miles in both directions, looking for a farm entrance or side road that could explain where the bus had gone, but he found nothing that would have allowed it to leave quickly. Even so, he filed an official report and told me to contact them immediately if I remembered any important details. Before we left, He mentioned that he had previously responded to reports from drivers describing attempts to block isolated highways using apparently abandoned vehicles to force passing motorists to slow down. He said that if I ever encountered anything similar in the middle of the night, the safest thing to do was keep my distance and seek help only after reaching a populated area. I arrived at my grandparents' house close to 2 in the morning. They immediately realized something was wrong because I looked much paler than usual. I told them everything that had happened before I even unpacked my bags. My grandfather, who had driven trucks for many years, stayed silent for a few moments before saying something I have never forgotten. He told me that whenever something on the road seems too strange to make sense, the best thing to do is trust your instincts and keep driving. The following morning, a police officer contacted me only to confirm a few details for the incident report. I asked whether they had found the bus or identified anyone. The answer was no. They had searched that stretch of highway throughout much of the night and again during the early morning hours, but they never found an abandoned school bus or received any additional reports connected to the same location. The report remained on file, but no one involved was ever identified. It's been several years since that trip, and I still drive long distances to visit my family. The difference is that now I never slow down simply because I come across an apparently abandoned vehicle on a completely isolated stretch of highway in the middle of the night. If I truly believe someone might need help, I continue driving until I reach a safe place where I can call the police instead of stopping alone on the roadside. What stayed with me most from that night wasn't the bus itself. It was the way those people behaved. They didn't chase after my car, they didn't shout for help, and they didn't show any frustration when they realized I had escaped. They simply walked back behind the bus as calmly as if it were part of a routine they had repeated countless times before. Whenever I think back to that scene, I realize that if I had slowed down for just a few more seconds or stopped completely to see what was happening, I probably would have been trapped exactly where they wanted me. And that's a possibility that still makes me think twice before stopping on any deserted highway in the middle of the night. Story 4. My name is Daniel, and this happened during the winter of 2023, when I was 41 years old. I worked as a telecommunications technician for a company that maintained transmission towers and radio links throughout eastern Tennessee. Since we serviced hospitals, public utilities, and telecommunications companies, it was common to receive emergency calls in the middle of the night. That week I was on call, and shortly after 11 o'clock at night I received a call informing me that a piece of equipment installed near a town in the mountains had gone offline. Light snow was expected at the higher elevations, so I decided to leave immediately before the situation became worse. I loaded my tools into the company pickup truck, filled the tank before leaving Knoxville, and headed down the highway through a very isolated region. I knew that route well. During the day it was a beautiful drive, surrounded by forests and mountains, but after midnight there was almost no traffic. On some stretches I could go several minutes without seeing another vehicle. Cell service also disappeared frequently because of the terrain, so I usually kept the truck's radio tuned to emergency frequencies to stay informed about accidents or road closures. It was already after 1 in the morning when I started climbing a more winding section of the highway. The temperature was close to freezing. A thin layer of fog hovered over the pavement, and the radio produced that familiar static that happens when the signal weakens between the mountains. Suddenly, the static was interrupted by an exceptionally clear transmission. A calm, professional-sounding male voice said something like, "Attention eastbound drivers. Police roadblock several miles ahead due to a rock slide. All traffic must use the temporary detour via the service road on the right. Reduce your speed and follow instructions at the scene." The message repeated twice before fading back into the radio static. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. Rock slides were relatively common in that region during the winter. I eased off the accelerator slightly and stayed alert, looking for the flashing patrol car lights that normally marked that kind of road closure. About 5 minutes later, I spotted several reflective traffic cones scattered across the highway. There was also a pickup truck parked near the entrance to a dirt service road. But something immediately caught my attention. There wasn't a single police cruiser, ambulance, or official vehicle anywhere in sight. I continued approaching slowly, trying to understand what was happening. The cones looked as though they had been thrown out in a hurry. Some were crooked, others barely reflected my headlights, and there were no official signs indicating construction, an accident, or a detour. The pickup truck also looked far too ordinary to be part of any emergency operation. It had no emergency lights, no company markings, and no equipment mounted on the roof. I took my foot off the accelerator but kept a safe distance. That's when my headlights illuminated the side of the pickup more clearly. Two men were crouched behind it, almost completely hidden by the truck bed. They weren't wearing uniforms, reflective vests, or anything resembling rescue personnel. The moment they noticed my truck approaching, one of them stepped out just enough to wave his arm, signaling for me to turn onto the dirt road. The other remained hidden, watching. My first thought was that maybe they were workers trying to improvise a roadblock before the police arrived. But I dismissed that idea almost immediately. If there really had been a rock slide farther ahead, why were they hiding behind the pickup instead of directing traffic from the roadway? At that moment, I decided not to turn onto the side road. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and stayed on the main highway. The man waving at me immediately realized I wasn't slowing down enough to make the turn. He began waving much more frantically, as though desperate for me to change direction. As I drove past the entrance to the service road, I caught a quick glimpse of what lay beyond the pickup. There were no construction crews, no official vehicles, and no real roadblock. Just the narrow dirt road disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I kept accelerating without looking back at the men. A few seconds later, I checked my rearview mirror and saw both of them running back toward the pickup. Almost immediately, its headlights came on. The engine roared to life, and the pickup pulled onto the highway behind me. My stomach dropped instantly. They hadn't been trying to direct traffic, they had simply been waiting for someone to follow them onto that dirt road. I looked in the rearview mirror again and watched the pickup quickly gain speed. Within seconds, it had already begun closing the gap between us. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the highway wound through a mountainous region full of sharp curves, so there was no safe way to drive much faster than the speed limit. The pickup stayed behind me for several miles, always close enough to keep me on edge. At times, it came so close that its headlights completely illuminated the inside of my truck's cab. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but just as I expected, the screen showed that I still had no signal. I kept driving, focused entirely on the road ahead. My only goal was to find somewhere well-lit or any kind of official vehicle. A few minutes later, I spotted an electronic message board over the highway, warning drivers about a maintenance area several miles ahead. That gave me a little hope. If crews were actually working there would almost certainly be workers or police nearby. I maintained my speed and continued toward the lights while the pickup remained right behind me, never attempting to pass and never giving up the pursuit. Shortly after the next curve, I finally saw flashing lights on the roadway. This time, they were the amber lights of maintenance vehicles, and a short distance farther ahead, a state highway patrol cruiser was parked partially on the shoulder. It was a real operation. The moment the men in the pickup saw those lights, they immediately slowed down. In my rearview mirror, I watched them make a quick U-turn through a small break in the median and disappear in the opposite direction before they ever got close to the patrol car. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped beside the official vehicles. A police officer walked up to my window and asked whether something was wrong. I told him everything that had just happened, including the radio transmission instructing drivers to take the service road. The officer immediately frowned. He told me there was no official detour anywhere in that area that night, and that no agency used that radio frequency to broadcast instructions to motorists. The service road I had seen wasn't even connected to the maintenance work they were performing. The officers drove back with me to the location where the cones had been placed. The trip took less than 15 minutes, but by the time we arrived, the scene had changed completely. There were no traffic cones on the highway, no pickup truck parked nearby, and no sign that anyone had been there only a short time earlier. The shoulder was empty, and the entrance to the service road remained open, dark, and completely silent. One of the officers drove a short distance down the service road in his patrol vehicle, while another scanned the surrounding woods with a powerful flashlight. They found no one. They also checked whether any state agency had authorized a road closure on that stretch of highway during the night, but there were no records of construction, accidents, or closures. The detail that caught their attention most was the radio transmission I had heard. One of the officers explained that messages intended for motorists are normally broadcast over specific channels and would rarely be picked up that way by an ordinary vehicle radio. He recorded all the information in the incident report and said they would investigate the possibility that someone had been using radio equipment to broadcast false messages in that area. I continued working for that company for another 2 years and never again received a service call to that same highway in the middle of the night. Whenever I had to drive through mountainous areas after dark, I remembered how calmly those men had waited behind the pickup, without any identification and without showing the slightest sense of urgency. They hadn't tried to block the highway or chase every passing vehicle. They were simply waiting for someone to believe they were following an official instruction. The more I think about it, the more I realize that the most dangerous part of that night wasn't the makeshift traffic cones or the pickup truck. It was the false sense of security created by a voice that sounded exactly like a real police dispatcher. If I had trusted only that transmission and turned onto the dirt road without paying attention to what was actually around me, I probably would have driven alone onto an isolated road, convinced I was following a legitimate instruction. Ever since then, I've learned that on any deserted highway, it's far better to lose a few minutes verifying an unusual situation than to blindly trust something that merely appears to be official. Story 5. My name is Michael, and this happened to me in the fall of 2022 when I was 38 years old. I worked as a sales representative for an agricultural equipment company and spent much of each month traveling through small towns across the American Midwest to visit clients and attend industry trade shows. That week, I had been attending a convention in Oklahoma City and was driving back home to Wichita, Kansas. The event ended later than expected because of a meeting with several distributors, and I decided to hit the road that same night instead of paying for another night at the hotel. I figured that if I drove for a few hours, I'd be able to sleep in my own bed before sunrise. I loaded my samples and catalogs into the trunk, filled up the gas tank, and left shortly before midnight. The route included a long stretch of rural highway surrounded by farms, open fields, and small patches of woods. It was a road I had driven many times during the day, but in the middle of the night it felt completely different. Traffic was almost non-existent, and there were several moments when I drove for 10 or 15 minutes without seeing another vehicle. At around 2 in the morning, after passing through a series of gentle curves, I noticed flashing lights on the shoulder a few hundred yards ahead. At first, I assumed it was a police car or a highway maintenance truck, so I eased off the accelerator slightly. As I got closer, I realized it was just a dark-colored sedan parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. Standing beside it was a couple. The woman was near the edge of the roadway, waving both arms as if trying to get the attention of passing drivers. The man stood several yards behind her, near the rear of the sedan, completely motionless. Even with my headlights shining directly on both of them, he didn't wave, raise a hand, or seem interested in asking for help. The woman, on the other hand, took a few steps toward the road and appeared to be saying something through my closed window, although I couldn't hear a word. My first thought was that their car had broken down and they needed a phone or a tow truck. Instinctively, I took my foot off the accelerator and started evaluating whether there was enough room to safely pull over a short distance ahead. As I slowed down, I automatically checked my rearview mirror to see whether another car was coming up behind me before pulling onto the shoulder. There wasn't another vehicle anywhere on the highway. It was at that exact moment that a small movement caught my attention along the right side of the road. I quickly glanced at my side mirror and managed to make out 2 silhouettes slowly emerging from the vegetation. They had been crouched among the bushes and only became visible when they stepped toward the shoulder. Neither of them made any gestures. They simply walked silently toward the rear of my car. My heart started pounding instantly. The woman continued waving frantically in front of me while the man remained standing beside the sedan, staring directly at me. The entire scene stopped looking like a plea for help and suddenly fell into place in a very different way. If I stopped where I had been planning to, my car would end up positioned between the couple and the 2 people who had just emerged from the brush. For the first time that night, I felt as though someone's position had been carefully planned. Without thinking twice, I lifted my foot off the brake and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The engine responded immediately, and the car surged forward before the woman could reach my driver's door. I drove past the sedan while watching through the corner of my windshield. The instant they realized I wasn't going to stop, the behavior of all 4 people changed completely. The woman immediately stopped waving and turned her back. The man ran toward the trees without looking behind him. The 2 people who had emerged from the brush also changed direction and quickly disappeared into the woods. None of them tried to chase my car down the highway. They simply returned to the exact places they had come from, as though their only concern was disappearing before another vehicle arrived and saw what had been happening. I watched in my rearview mirror for several seconds, and was still able to see the group fading back into the darkness, while the sedan remained parked on the shoulder, with its hazard lights flashing, looking exactly as though it were waiting for the next person willing to stop and help. I drove for several miles without slowing down. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers began to ache. I kept glancing back and forth between the road and my mirrors, afraid I would see that sedan or another vehicle appear behind me. Fortunately, nothing did. About 20 minutes later, I found a gas station that stayed open overnight, mostly serving truck drivers. I pulled into the parking lot, parked near the entrance to the convenience store, and sat there for a few moments trying to catch my breath. As soon as my phone regained service, I called the highway patrol and explained exactly where I had seen the stranded car and everything I had witnessed. The dispatcher asked several times whether I was certain there had been 4 people. I told him I was. I explained that I had initially seen only the couple, but that the other 2 people had emerged from the brush just as I began slowing down. He instructed me to remain at the gas station while a patrol unit was sent to check the location. He also advised me not to return to that stretch of highway alone. Nearly half an hour later, 2 police officers arrived at the gas station, took down all the details, and then drove to the location I had described. One of them returned about 40 minutes later to tell me what they had found. By the time they reached the scene, the sedan was no longer on the shoulder. There was also no sign of the couple or the other 2 people. The only thing they found was a fresh set of tire tracks in the grass beside the road, indicating that the car had left the shoulder not long before they arrived. The officer mentioned that similar schemes had been reported on isolated highways in the region, always involving situations designed to trigger a driver's natural instinct to help someone who appeared to be in trouble. In most cases, the victims didn't realize there were additional people hiding nearby until it was too late to leave safely. He said I'd probably made the right decision by not stopping, especially since there hadn't been another vehicle on the road at that hour that could have served as a witness if something had happened. The following morning, after finally making it home and getting a few hours of sleep, I kept wondering whether exhaustion had caused me to overreact. But the more I replayed the scene in my mind, the more the details made sense. If it had really been a mechanical breakdown, the man would probably have been the first one standing near the road asking for help. Instead, he stayed back, watching. The other 2 people didn't come running when they noticed a potential rescuer. They remained hidden until the exact moment I started slowing down. The behavior of all 4 changed the instant I accelerated again. There were no frustrated shouts, no desperate pleas for me to come back, and no attempt to convince another driver who might arrive moments later. They simply disappeared as quietly as they had appeared. A few days later, a police officer contacted me to say the investigation remained open, but there were no identified suspects. No vehicle matching the description had been located, and there were no cameras along that stretch of highway capable of recording what had happened. Ever since that night, I've never stopped alone to help someone on a completely deserted highway in the middle of the night. If I come across someone who appears to need assistance, I continue driving until I reach a safe location, call the police, and report exactly where the person is. I still believe that most people genuinely need help when their car breaks down on the side of the road. The problem is that it only takes one group willing to exploit that instinct to turn an ordinary situation into an extremely dangerous trap. What has stayed with me most wasn't the woman waving or the sedan with its hazard lights flashing. It was the moment I saw those 2 silhouettes quietly emerging from the vegetation at the exact instant my car began losing speed. Even today, whenever I drive along a rural highway at night and see someone stopped on the shoulder, the first thing I do isn't look at the person asking for help. I carefully look at everything around them before making any decision. Story 6. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and this happened to me in early spring of 2024 when I was 34 years old. I'm a landscape photographer, and whenever I had a few days free between commercial assignments, I liked to travel alone across the western United States in search of places that were still largely unexplored. That week, I decided to drive part of US 50 in Nevada, a highway famous for crossing hundreds of miles of nearly deserted terrain. My goal was to reach a series of rocky hills before sunrise so I could photograph the first light of the morning. I had already studied the location using satellite imagery and knew the best light would last only a few minutes. To arrive on time, I had to leave the small town where I had spent the night just before midnight. I loaded all my camera gear into the back of my SUV, filled the gas tank completely, packed enough water for the entire day, and started driving. The road was completely dry, the sky was clear, and the moon illuminated much of the surrounding desert. Traffic was almost non-existent. On many stretches, I couldn't see another vehicle in either direction, just miles of asphalt cutting through dark plains surrounded by distant mountains. After about 40 minutes of driving, I glanced into my rearview mirror out of habit and noticed a dark shape behind me. At first, I assumed it was just another driver traveling the same highway. The strange thing was that I couldn't see any headlights. I kept watching for several seconds until I realized there really was a car behind me, but it was traveling completely without its lights on. The only reason I could make it out at all was because its silhouette contrasted against the pale pavement, illuminated by the moon. I figured it might have just come off a dirt road, or perhaps was having electrical problems. I continued driving normally, and a few minutes later I looked in the mirror again. The car was still exactly the same distance behind me. Not any closer, not any farther away. I thought it was odd, but not yet alarming. I only became genuinely uneasy after repeating that glance over and over during the next hour. No matter how the road curved, whether I climbed small hills or how fast I drove, that dark car remained almost exactly in the same spot behind me, never turning on its headlights for even a single second. After watching it for nearly an hour, I decided to try a small experiment. I gradually slowed from about 70 miles per hour to a little over 50, pretending I was simply driving more cautiously. I assumed the other driver would eventually catch up or pass me. Nothing happened. The car remained exactly where it had been, keeping the same distance as though someone were carefully matching every movement I made. A few minutes later, I accelerated again to a higher speed than I had been maintaining since the start of the trip. I checked the rearview mirror once more, expecting to finally create some distance between us. Even then, the silhouette remained practically frozen in the same position on the highway. That was when I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. It made no sense for someone to drive for that long on a deserted highway, with their lights completely off. It was also hard to believe that two strangers would, by pure coincidence, maintain exactly the same pace for so many miles. I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation, but none of them felt convincing. For the first time that night, I began thinking it might be smarter to make a quick stop somewhere well lit before continuing. A few miles later, I spotted a small 24-hour gas station. It was one of those isolated stations in the middle of the desert that mainly serves truck drivers and travelers, with only a handful of fuel pumps and a convenience store brightly illuminated by floodlights. I pulled into the parking lot without using my turn signal on purpose, making the turn at the last possible moment to see whether the car would continue down the highway. As soon as I turned into the fuel pumps, I glanced quickly into my rearview mirror. The road behind me was completely empty. For the first time since I had noticed that vehicle, I couldn't see it anymore. I felt an enormous sense of relief. I parked near the entrance to the store, went inside to buy a bottle of water, and decided to use the restroom before continuing my trip. I wasn't inside for more than 3 or 4 minutes. When I pushed the door open and stepped back into the parking lot, I stopped dead in my tracks. The same dark car was parked right beside my SUV. It was still completely dark, with no headlights, taillights, or interior lights on. The windows were tinted too heavily to see inside. There was no one visible in the front seats. While I was still trying to figure out how the vehicle had gotten there without me seeing it arrive, I heard a very faint metallic click. The rear passenger side door slowly began to open. I froze for a moment, staring at the door as it continued opening little by little. I heard no voices, no footsteps, and no sound other than the hum of the gas station lights and the wind moving through the empty parking lot. Instinctively, I took 2 steps backward without taking my eyes off the car. The door opened just enough to create a narrow, dark gap, but no one stepped out. Somehow, that felt even stranger than if someone had simply gotten out normally. I waited for several seconds that felt much longer than they really were. Then I noticed a subtle movement coming from the far side of the vehicle, almost hidden by the body of the car. Someone was crouching behind it. using the open rear door as cover so they couldn't be seen from where I was standing. The instant I realized that, I immediately turned around and walked back into the convenience store. The clerk behind the counter noticed how nervous I was before I even said a word. I quickly explained that there was a car parked beside mine and that I believed it had been following me for nearly an hour. He looked out the window, picked up the phone, and said he was calling the sheriff's office, which normally handled incidents in that area during the night. While we waited, I stayed away from the glass entrance doors and watched the parking lot through one of the side windows. Less than a minute later, I saw a man emerge from behind the dark car. He calmly walked over to the rear door, which was still open, looked around briefly and closed it. A moment later, another man appeared on the driver's side. Neither of them looked directly toward the store. They got into the car without any sense of urgency, but instead of turning on the headlights immediately, they remained completely still for several seconds. Only then did they start the engine and slowly pull out of the parking lot. The headlights stayed off until they reached the highway again. Only after they were a considerable distance away did the lights briefly come on, before disappearing into the darkness of the desert. The clerk quietly commented that their behavior made no sense for people who were simply traveling. If they had really wanted gas or a break, they would have stopped like anyone else. Instead, it looked as though they had simply been waiting for me to return to my vehicle alone. About 20 minutes later, a deputy from the sheriff's office arrived at the gas station. I told him the entire sequence of events, from the moment I first noticed the car on US 50 to the rear door opening beside my SUV. He listened carefully and asked several questions about the model of the car, its color, the direction it had gone, and whether I had been able to read the license plate. Unfortunately, the distance during the drive and the poor lighting in the parking lot had made that impossible. The deputy drove several miles down the highway in the direction the vehicle had disappeared, but returned about half an hour later without finding anything. According to him, that stretch of US 50 had countless dirt roads branching off into the desert, many of which could be reached just a few miles beyond the gas station. Before I left, he recommended that I not continue traveling alone at that hour of the night. I decided to wait until sunrise at the station, drinking coffee and organizing my camera equipment. I ended up reaching my photography location later than I had planned, but for the first time that night I finally felt safe again. To this day, I still photograph remote landscapes, including many in Nevada, but that night completely changed the way I travel. I no longer ignore behavior that seems out of the ordinary just because I can't immediately explain it. I also stopped believing that an isolated road automatically means peace and safety. In places where almost no one passes, all it takes is a single vehicle appearing at the wrong moment to change everything. What has stayed with me most isn't the dark car or the fact that it remained behind me for so many miles. It's the memory of walking out of the restroom convinced I had lost it, only to find it silently parked beside my SUV, completely dark, while the rear door slowly began opening right in front of me. If I had walked absent-mindedly back to my SUV without looking around, I might never have realized that someone was already waiting for the exact moment to approach me. Ever since then, before getting into my vehicle during any nighttime trip, the very first thing I do is carefully observe everything happening around me.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.